So during the first phase, God is like the mother, showing a sweetness to her child and allowing it to come quite near, and then the sweetness is withdrawn. We may wait in this way for years, just as the paralytic man in the Gospels waited by the pond of Bethsaida for the coming of the angel. Throughout this repeated successions of risings and fallings, the mean level may continue about the same for a considerable time. The eighth character consists in this, that the mystic union requires much less effort than meditation, and correspondingly less again as the state is a higher one. Saint Teresa makes use of, to depict the successive degrees of prayer in the book of her life, she regards the soul as a gardener. And I can relate to this because I'm a gardener, watering his garden with ever less and less labor. In the prayer of quiet, an effort is still required. This does not consist in procuring the substance of the prayer for ourselves. God alone can bestow it, but one, in driving away distractions, a labor that is never wholly successful. This must be done gently so that we do not injure the mystic union itself. And two, in producing here and there such additional acts as we have an attraction or facility for. And three, in restraining the weariness which the semi-aridity causes when the prayer of quiet is experienced in a low degree, and in resisting the temptation to discontinue the prayer. And from fatigue, from the moment that labor and renewed effort are required, there's a certain amount of fatigue. And we scarcely heed this if the prayer of quiet is intense. And we continue at prayer without difficulty for 3 or 4 hours together. And that's what I've always spoken about, meditation for 3 hours or longer. And then she says, but if the prayer of quiet is weak, fatigue is felt after half an hour or an hour. But here's where the discipline comes in, where you do it anyway. And the ninth character of the mystic union, and that consists in that it is accompanied by sentiments of love, of repose, of pleasure, and then also often of suffering. And sometimes those modes of love are almost imperceptible. Other times the soul's ardors become very apparent under the influence of the mystic union, and they can become so intense that they may even be violent movements. So now we enter the ninth character of the mystic union. The ninth character of the mystic union is that it is accompanied by sentiments of love, of repose, of pleasure, and often of suffering. The sentiments of love are always produced by the mystic union, but it sometimes happens the love is very calm and even almost imperceptible, but at other times the soul's ardors become very apparent under the influence of the mystic union, and they may even be violent ardors of love. These great transports probably occur only when the soul has attained to the full union. They are often accompanied by a real anguish, an intense desire to see God. Whatever the strength of this love, we feel that it is produced of itself without our having done anything to bring it about. We even feel that if we wish to strengthen it, and we secretly do desire this, it would be labor lost. We don't have that power within us. We are in the passive state. We can barely accept what we receive. And this is also so in the case of ecstasy. It is with this grace as with the spiritual embrace. It is experienced at first for a few seconds at a time only, by gusts, as it were. The two graces are now separated, now unified. This doubtless is the grace that Saint Teresa wished to describe when she says that we sometimes inhale, as it were, some delicate perfume. It's important to note that it is not then a mere sweetness, the fragrance produced by the thought of God, but it is a way of tasting God himself. There are these fragrant realms in the mystical spheres that we do taste of. And this is one of the reasons I often tell people to not hesitate to use fragrance, incenses, essential oils, to shrink the realms between our lower human realm sphere and the heavenly spheres to make it easier to travel to the higher abodes. Using fragrance in that way can accentuate your out-of-body travel. The unlearned in mysticism fancy that the soul enjoys continual consolations, and they sometimes go on to say contemptuously, "Personally, I prefer to be led by a more rugged road, that of the cross. But God, as they should understand, does not dispense his intimate friends from the cross, quite the contrary. And further, the mystic state brings with it sufferings which are peculiar to it and which may be felt even during prayer. There are the sufferings of the beginners who have not yet been instructed in regard to these things. One of the great causes of suffering is the need to possess God more fully, which it's a hunger that you cannot fulfill in this life. Stronger and more exalted God's communications, the more acute becomes the thirst for a still more complete communication. St. Teresa tells us of the martyrdom that she underwent at certain times, in which she describes in her hymn, "I die in that I do not die." The soul then arrives at the anguish of love. Even in the prayer of quiet, the suffering is very keen at times. To illustrate the possibility of the statement, let us imagine a man who, wishing to hear a magnificent concert, can nearly with great difficulty get access to a small crack in a partition where he would catch fragments only of the harmony. What he hears would obviously cause him great pleasure, but at the same time, all that he misses would be a sorrow to him. It is possible then to feel both pleasure and grief at the same time, although in proportions that vary according to the circumstances of the particular case. When the sentiments of pleasure and suffering are of almost equal strength and are both very ardent, the resulting state takes the name of wound of love. A great sweetness is felt. The lover does not wish to quit the thought of his beloved. He enjoys it, but at the same time he feels his heart torn because of his absence from him or her, or because of the difficulty in conversing with him freely. There is thus a mingling of joy and of sorrow. So too it's possible to have delicious experiences of God and of his love, and to feel at the same time the secret anguish, which is nothing other than the thirst for God enkindled by himself. Sometimes this suffering has another cause. We are conscious of the desire to serve God, and at the same time we feel that we are doing almost nothing for him. Very common suffering there. There are periods of abundance, but also of complete absence, in which the mystic state disappears completely at times, even in the case of an ecstatic. There are many examples of this in mystical history. St. Joseph of Cupertino, one of the great mystics and ecstatics, experienced this profoundly. After literally experiencing profound ecstatic states and literally levitating and flying, he would have it completely withdrawn from him. This is very common, and it is to be expected in the mystical life. That's another thing that people can get very, very frustrated by, and it actually sometimes scares them because they feel like they have somehow lost favor in the sight of God. And what they need to understand is that we are not given to receive those consolations at all times in our life. And it is normal that they will be withdrawn and only be given when God so deigns it helpful and necessary. So we almost have to remember to pull from and live on these things that we have been given to see, such as an example being Mother Teresa, who literally created a worldwide mission from the one vision she was given as a young woman. And she was able to sustain that mission with that one impetus that was given to her. Enough energy was pumped into her to make it happen. We forget that actually in the mystical life, We are given more consolations in the beginning and less consolations as we progress. More difficulties are given to us as we progress. We know that we are loved and that we are on a good path by the nature of how we serve Him, not by whether or not good things happen to us, because it rains on the just and the unjust alike. And so sufferings will come to us. This is the nature of our lives on earth. Illnesses, betrayals, difficulties, these things will come to us all. We don't need to bring them upon ourselves for sure, but when they come, we don't need to look at them as a lack of favor from God. We don't need to concern ourselves that the normal mortal nature of this realm indicates that we are no longer loved by God. And also, when those mystic states disappear completely at times, quote unquote, that is to be expected. It is normal. And it is not a sign that God has abandoned you or that you are no longer in His good graces or that you have done something to warrant being thrown out. It could be as simple as God feels that you are strong enough to stand on your own 2 feet for this time. It gives us a whole new way of understanding the mystic path. It's not like, yay, let's keep doing this so that we can gather more and more amazing experiences and graces. It is, we do this for the greater will of God, for the sanctification of our souls, and for whatever He deems its use will be in every individual one of us. When He deems that it is to be withdrawn, we also know and accept that. Holiness, it's living a life, ironically, according to a lot of the ascetical theology, which is trying to cultivate the virtues and overcome the vices in our daily lives. But can even go back to the simplicity of what Jesus told me in my near-death experience years ago, which is that we are working towards moving away from selfishness to selflessness, to give of ourselves rather than to just receive of ourselves, to remove our big egos and become humble in the eyes of God. So to cultivate humility, cultivate the virtues, to become an instrument of God's will rather than an instrument of our own will, to seek to become an instrument of service to one another rather than just of service to ourselves. Going into the efficacy and the power of the divine office and the prayer of the angels from earth to heaven. But in order for us to really embrace all these things, we want to take it sequentially. So we go to the 10th character of the mystic union. The mystic union is accompanied, and it often takes a very visible manner, by an impulsion towards the different virtues. God does not come empty-handed, so to speak, to the soul, and His sanctifying action is so much stronger and more sensible as the prayer is higher. Saint Teresa tells us this constantly. The soul who permeates herself with God in the mystic union feels that she, without knowing exactly how, permeates herself with love, humility, and devotion. To begin with, divine love is the natural effect, as it were, of this kind of prayer, and it would of itself suffice to excite the soul to virtue, provided, that is to say, that she had a certain spiritual grounding. It gives an inclination for solitude, because God is more easily found there. It shows itself by aversion from sin and detachment from all that is not God, and it removes all obstacles to perfection. Teaches humility, for we love to make ourselves of no account before those whom we tenderly love and of whose superiority we are conscious. Finally, it impels to generosity and to the spirit of sacrifice. And at the same time, God provides occasions for the exercising of these dispositions. He sends trials of all kinds, temptations, sickness, want of success, injustices, and contempt. He imposes the most grievous sacrifices. Certain virtues are sometimes given quite suddenly. So in the 10th character of the mystic union, it's accompanied, and this is often in a very visible manner, by an impulsion towards the different virtues. God does not come empty-handed, so to speak, to the soul, and his sanctifying action is so much the stronger and more sensible as the prayer is higher. Saint Teresa tells us this constantly. The soul who permeates herself with God in the mystic union feels that she thus, without knowing exactly how, permeates herself with love, humility, and devotion. To begin with, divine love is the natural effect, as it were, of this kind of prayer, and it would of itself suffice to excite the soul to virtue, provided, that is to say, that she had a certain spiritual grounding. It teaches humility, for we love to make ourselves of no account before those whom we love tenderly and of those whose superiority we are conscious. Finally, it impels us to generosity and to the spirit of sacrifice. And at the same time, God provides occasions for the exercising of these dispositions. So he sends trials of all kinds, temptations, sicknesses, want of success, injustices, or contempt. He imposes the most grievous sacrifices. And the remarkable thing is that certain virtues are sometimes given quite suddenly. Saint Teresa refers to these instantaneous changes in the soul, and she symbolizes them by the figure of the ugly crawling worms becoming a beautiful swift flying butterfly. Certain faults have always resisted our efforts, our examen of conscience, and then suddenly, as we pass to more advanced, deeper prayer, we find our faults corrected without any industry of our own. In this way, God wills to show his power over our soul. And this also shows us how these things are happening in energy without our awareness when it appears that nothing is going on. And so that's important to note. So the 11th character of the mystic union is that the union acts upon the body, which it in turn acts upon it again. In the case of ecstasy, it is clear that the mystic union acts upon the body, and it is from this that the definition of the degree is derived. And that action is exercised in 4 ways. 1, the senses cease to act, or they convey a confused knowledge only. And according as the cessation of action on the part of the senses is complete or almost complete, the ecstasy itself is called complete or incomplete. Number 2, as a general rule, the limbs become immovable, and one can neither speak nor walk nor make any gestures unless God restores his power miraculously. This last state is called mobile ecstasy. There are some examples of this exception: St. Catherine of Siena, St. Catherine of Ricci, St. Mary Magdalene of Pazzi. We have accounts of what they saw or heard. St. Mary Magdalene of Pazzi spoke so rapidly at times that 6 secretaries were required to take down her utterances. She sometimes walked during her ecstasies. On one occasion, she even climbed up one of the columns of the church without the aid of a ladder. This occurred frequently with Catherine Emmerich when she was sacristan, and it was necessary to clean or decorate cornices or other places that were, humanly speaking, inaccessible. St. Francis of Rome heard her confessor's questions when she was in an ecstasy, but not those of other persons. She composed verses of hymns at these times, which she sang. She moved and made gestures corresponding to the consoling or sorrowful pictures that were passing before her in vision. She took part in these scenes, getting ready the manger, for instance, which seemed to her to be about to receive our blessed Lord upon his nativity. She saw that repetitively in her visions. The respiration is almost arrested in part 3 of this state. Sometimes it seems to be so completely so. It is also the same with heartbeats and consequently the pulse. In all these things, there are differences of degree according as the contemplation is more or less deep. Several persons have told Father Poulain that they only saw the objects about them as though they were veiled by a whitish mist. It is like an evenly dispersed fog or the smoke of incense. This fog has its fluctuations like the prayer itself. And with the prayer, it increases in strength at times and then diminishes in the same way. The eyes are closed, the influence of the prayer of quiet is less easily shown. The union then has to be very strong. The eyes feel as if they are being darkened. So much so that at certain moments, that when the state is at its deepest, it is as though the soul is in complete darkness. In the case of ecstatics, we meet occasionally with the following phenomena which concern the body. 1, the body rises up into the air, levitation. 2, it can be enveloped in a luminous aureole. 3, it can emit a fragrance. These phenomena are not a necessary effect of the mystic union itself, like those we have described above. They're just super added to it. When God produces these exceptional phenomenon, it's usually with the object of giving credit to one of his servants whom he has charged with some important mission. Sometimes the ecstatics develop considerable strength in their ascents. For instance, in the life of Saint Joseph of Cupertino, we read that on 3 occasions he and one of his companions carried him up with him into the air. He was present one day at a ceremony in which 10 men were vainly endeavoring to hold up and fix a heavy cross, and he darted forward, flying as though he were a bird through the air, lifted up that cross, and like a feather, and fixed it in its place. Interestingly, on the alternative, sometimes the ecstatic's body cannot be moved. It's as resistant as a rock. We see this many times in the case of Marian apparitions, like at Fatima, Garabandal, many of the Marian apparitions of the 20th century. St. Mary Magdalene of Pazzi became sometimes so heavy during her ecstasies they couldn't move her. They were not even able to stir her arm or her hand. When she did recover use of her senses, she felt pain in such of her limbs as had been roughly handled. There's no fixed rule with regard to the height of which the body might ascend in levitation with those of the ecstatics who do have this phenomenon. When St. Francis of Assisi had withdrawn to Mount Alverna, Brother Leo stated that he would lift up to a man's height from the ground, sometimes above the highest trees, and at others so high that he was no longer visible. And there are as many variations in the lives of the other ecstatic saints.